The Society for Vascular Surgery has recently decided to develop an audiovisual archive of the leaders of vascular surgery who have made this a subspecialty as seen today. A committee was formed called the History Work Group Project to undertake this project. The committee was chaired by Jimmy Yao with Norman Rich and me as other members. Cal Ernst served as our consultant. Younger members have been recently added as well. Bill Baker, Mark Eskandari, Melina Kibbe, Peter Lawrence, and Walter McCarthy. In addition, Bill Pierce has recently been added. My name is Roger Gregory, and today we'll be interviewing the world-famous surgeon, Dr. George Noon. But before we start the interview, I'd like to make an editorial comment. Dr. Noon is clearly unique. Unlike many of his Houston colleagues and icons, Dr. Noon has always shunned the spotlight, always modest. Certainly this is a unique characteristic in Texas. George, thank you for agreeing to this interview.
Thank you, Roger. It's a pleasure to be here.
George, let's first talk about your early years.
All right.
You were born in 1934 in Nogales.
Right.
Is that how you pronounce it?
That's Nogales, yeah.
Nogales, Arizona. Your father was a general surgeon.
Right.
And your mother a nurse.
Right.
So obviously this was a huge influence.
Well, it was a great influence, and then actually when I got to college, I didn't think of anything else that I'd rather do than go into medicine from that influence that I had, especially from my father. My mother was more a mother than a nurse. She was mothering. There were 6 of us in our family, children. And
anyone else go into medicine?
None of the others went into medicine. One went into entomology. He's a PhD in entomology, but no others that went to medicine.
Tell us about your early education, grammar school. Was this public or private?
Well, I went to public schools in Nogales, Arizona. I did some school in California when my father was in the World War II. We had moved to California and Los Angeles and then up close to Modesto. Then I came back to Nogales and finished up grade school and junior high, high school. And then from there I went to the University of Arizona where I got my undergraduate degree.
But before that, you went to Boise State and ran into another would-be surgeon, Dr. Norm Rich. Is that right?
That's right.
And you guys behind the scenes rigged who was going to be the next president.
Well, we tried to.
So tell us about the University of Arizona.
Well, at that time, the University of Arizona did not have a medical school that it has now. So it was just a regular university, and I enjoyed the school, and it was the alma mater of my father and many of my relatives.
Was it?
Yeah.
Now, after you graduated in 1956, why Baylor?
Well, I looked at several medical schools, and of course, that we were interviewing in the like September, October, where it was still hot and humid, and most of the southern schools that I had interviewed, and Baylor had a brand new building that had air conditioning, and it also had Dr. DeBakey. And
was that when you heard of Dr. DeBakey first?
I'd actually heard of Dr. DeBakey before I went to medical school, when I was at the University of Arizona. And so we heard not only of Dr. DeBakey, but also of Dr. Cooley and their accomplishments at that time. And so that inspired me to consider coming to Baylor to try and be among those people that they were training and working with.
So, after your medical school at Baylor, you interned at Jeff Davis Hospital. What was that like, George?
What was it like? Well, at that time, it was a 24/7 service, pretty much. And we worked really hard. It was a city-county hospital. At that time, it was still segregated. So there was
Really?
Yeah, what they call the Negro side or the black side and the white services. So they were split up at that hospital at that time.
This is prior to this becoming Ben Taub.
That's prior to Ben Taub, right.
Now, after your internship, you did a surgical residency at Baylor, then a thoracic surgery residency. Concurrently, during your thoracic surgery residency, you were the assistant chief of surgery at Ben Taub.
That's right.
Now, how did that come about?
They needed somebody to fill that position, and I was a pretty good candidate, I guess, and they selected me to do it and asked me if I would, and of course I agreed to and did it.
What did this amount to? What did you have to do?
Well, we had to spend time over there with the residents and help them in the operating room and making rounds on the wards, conferences, etc., just like a regular staff attending.
Okay. Take a moment to tell me about your personal life, George. Did you get married during training?
I got married in the second year, after the second year of medical school, and started having children when I was a resident.
How many children do you
Well, I've
have?
got 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls.
All grown up now?
All grown up now, and right now I've got 12 grandchildren, so we've really expanded.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. I know that you talked about spending some time with your grandson in the last conversation you had with Dr. DeBakey.
Right. I had gone over to his house to visit him.
Right.
Right. And we had visited for about an hour, and actually I had some gumbo and he had some ice cream that he was eating, and I got, for the gumbo, had some peppers from his yard that he grew. And when we finished up, I told him I was going to a baseball game. My son was in a tournament, and then after that we were going to be going to Aspen for a week. And so when I was walking out the door, he said, "Well, good luck to your grandson. See you when you get back from Aspen." I said, "Okay, sir." And then within an hour, hour and a half, they called me and said he'd arrested at home.
I'm sorry, George.
Yeah.
Tell me about your hobbies. I know that you've always been a safe and experienced pilot by virtue of the fact that you're here now.
Right. Well,
When did you start flying?
I started flying actually when I was 17. In high school, I didn't get my license until I was actually in medical school. My father had an airplane, a single engine. We used to fly down to Mexico to go fishing, and so that's the way I got into piloting.
Did he teach you?
No, I had an instructor that taught me, and I learned, of course, the first part of it in Arizona and finished up here in Houston, Texas, in the flat country versus the hilly country we came from in Arizona.
No ranch, no cows, no oil wells.
No, I've got,
Pecans.
I had pecans.
Tell us about that adventure.
Well, I went into the pecan business with some friends of mine from Spain and from South Texas, and we had about 3,000 acres of pecans. Only 570 of those were mine. And we were doing pretty well out about 12 years, and DuPont had a little mistake, and they even got insecticide and pesticide mixed up, and when we put it on our trees, it sort of stunted them and stopped their production. So that was the end of our pecan business right there.
Let's talk about your practice career now, George. You decided to stay at Baylor. Why?
Well, I enjoyed what I was doing. I went through the general surgery and thoracic surgery residency program and worked with Dr. DeBakey and Dr. Cooley. And Dr. DeBakey asked me if I would stay after I completed my residency program. And of course I wanted to stay. It was everything was booming at that time. It was a center of activity.
Explosive.
An explosion. And I think we got to be pretty good surgeons working in that environment.
No doubt about it. Had you always wanted to be an academic surgeon, George?
Not always, but after I guess the second year of medical school, I thought that that's what I'd like to do. In the environment that we were presented with Dr. DeBakey and his service, that was attractive to me.
So you stayed at Baylor, and by 1975 you were a full professor, less than 10 years.
Right.
Incredible that you moved along that fast.
Well, it's lucky, I guess.
That and talent. From 2000 until the current time, you've been the chief of transplant and assist devices. Also, the co-founder of the Vascular Non-Invasive Lab.
Right.
A real feat, because having been there a little bit earlier than that time, there was not much enthusiasm for non-invasive testing at Methodist.
Yeah, there was that feeling. The vascular surgeon said, if you can't tell what's going on, you shouldn't be taking care of these patients.
Right, that's what I was told when I was
Yeah.
there.
Right.
But you somehow decided that there was a place.
Well, we thought there was a place, and we wanted to develop it. And I was able to get some donations from some people that allowed us to buy the equipment to get the lab started, and we boomed from there on. And of course, it was slow progress. The development of new ways of imaging, the duplex scanning, etc., compared to the old ways that we used to do it.
But actually, in the final analysis, Dr. DeBakey was helpful.
Of course he was. Yeah, he encouraged us to do it, and he used the lab. He was one of our users.
And George, you had no formal time in the military, yet you had close ties with military medicine. How did you avoid formal military service?
Well, what happened was, it was a long time ago, when they had the Berlin crisis, we were drafted to go into the service, and I was drafted along with other classmates of mine to go into service, and I received my orders and was set to go, and then they decided they would be able to let a few individuals stay back because they were completely decimating the programs and for the care of the patients locally. And I was selected as one of those to get to stay behind, so I didn't have to go into service, and then later on I wasn't called in at all either.
Yet you really maintained close ties with military medicine. I guess this is where Norm Rich rises again.
Right, Norm Rich rises again, and then also, of course, Dr. DeBakey.
Correct. Sure.
Right.
George, you've been the founding partner in the Texas Surgical Associates from '97 to 2000. What was that about?
That was about not getting along with your new chief of surgery.
I guess we should go to the next question then. George, of all the attendings in Houston, at least when I was there, you were the only one fluent in Spanish.
Right.
This was a big advantage to you in practice.
Well, it was a big advantage, and I was able to communicate with the patients that came from Mexico, Central and South America, and Spain, and also facilitated my trips down to those countries where I was able to give lectures and also did demonstration operations in most of those countries.
In Spanish?
In Spanish.
George, do you think residents today should learn Spanish?
I think it'd be very helpful because the Spanish population or Latin population is increasing within the United States, and a lot of them aren't very fluent in English.
Did you do anything besides taking Spanish in school? Or?
No, I didn't really. I just got together with my friends, and I'd put together the lectures together and did a little bit here and there, and then I knew what it was supposed to sound like. I might not know whether it's preteritive or whatever.
Let's talk a little bit about your publications and honors. You have a massive publication list exceeding 350 papers.
Mm-hmm.
And although your later publications have been primarily on cardiac and transplant topics, your earlier publications were certainly important vascular topics. The list of organizations and honors that you've been involved in are absolutely startling,
Mm-hmm.
George. You were the president of the Michael DeBakey Society, and in 2008, in fact, received the DeBakey Award,
Right.
which was quite prestigious. Also, the University of Arizona Alumni Achievement Award,
Right.
which I think they had a lot of people that they could have looked at, but didn't. Also, the Space Technology Hall of Fame Award
Right.
for your ventricular assist device that we'll come back to later.
Okay.
And needless to say, AOA. With all these huge successes and recognition, George, did you have any failures?
Did I have any failures? Not right offhand.
I know every human being is going to have failures, but anything that happened that made you feel like there were things that you needed to learn, or?
Well, I was always in the learning mode, but as far as being a failure mode, no, I don't think I tried to stay out of that.
There's several focus areas that I'd like to talk about
Okay.
now. As we'd mentioned before, when you came on the scene in Houston, this was a time of explosive development of both cardiac and vascular surgery in
Right.
Houston. You were really on the ground floor. What was that like?
Well, it was really exciting because the development of cardiovascular surgery was taking place underneath our eyes, and we were seeing it not only being developed but practiced in the hospital and taking care of patients who otherwise, up to that time, were pretty much a death sentence or an amputation risk. So, and then we were able to, as things developed, you know, you get to go from homografts to Dacron grafts, and you know, developing the instruments you were talking about. You know, they were not available at the time that we were in this surgery, so we had the procedure, but we had to develop the instruments for it. The monitoring systems were not available. It was just a finger and a blood pressure cuff, which didn't do too good when you're on pump. And there were a lot of things like that. There was no ICU when we first started.
No.
That
But
was-
when I got there, I'd never seen anything like that at ICU.
Right.
50 beds.
And at that time,
Dynamite
when
nurses.
you got there, the residents would be assigned to the ICU for a period of 3 months without
Yes.
leaving.
Yes. Which I was able to sidestep.
Yeah.
Did you do that, George, as a resident?
Well, I did it as a resident. Yeah, I lived in the hospital for 3 months. If you can call it living.
Now, let's talk for a moment about Dr. DeBakey.
Okay.
Talk about, George, your transition from being a resident and trainee under Dr. DeBakey to becoming a trusted associate. How did that happen? What was that like?
Well, it happens with a lot of hard work, a lot of dedication. That's the way it happened.
So this was a gradual.
Right, of course, you're going through residency and getting exposed to him in residency, and so I knew what I was getting into, and it was quite an experience.
I can remember when I was here as a fellow, George, that I heard Dr. DeBakey say that if he ever needed surgery, he wanted George Noon. I thought to myself then, that's the greatest compliment I've ever heard.
Well, that was nice of him to say that.
Well, it's an incredible compliment that he wanted nobody but George Noon. Let's talk for a moment about the Moscow trips that you did with Dr. DeBakey. When I was in the research lab in the early 70s, I saw a clipping from the New York Times. DeBakey treats Russian. It was learned Sunday that 2 months ago, Dr. DeBakey, a Houston heart surgeon, performed a successful operation on the president of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, Dr. Keldysh.
Right.
The American physician was called in, Pravda said. When Keldysh was seriously ill and an urgent reconstructive operation of the aorta and other vessels were needed. He is now feeling well, the paper added. George, tell us about that operation and that trip.
Well, it all started with Keldysh, who of course was the president of the Academy of Science. He was the head of all scientific activities within the Soviet Union at that time. And he had aortoiliac occlusive disease and had having claudication and was having some rest pain. And actually had been seen, I think he'd been in Mexico and came through Houston and stopped at NASA, and Dr. DeBakey saw him there.
Oh, okay.
And then, of course, it was decided that he was going to need an operation, and the thing was, where do we do it, U.S. or in the Soviet Union? And so it was elected to do it over there in the Soviet Union. So we made arrangements to go over there.
Now, I'd heard that everything went over there, the entire OR from Houston.
Well, we took all the instruments, grafts, sutures, etc. that we needed. We took a nurse, his scrub nurse, and actually took my wife, who wasn't a nurse, but we trained her to act as a circulating nurse.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And they were surprised when they found out she wasn't a nurse when she was in there taking care of it. But yes, we took it all, and then we had to do his arteriograms over there, so the translumbar aortogram and bilateral femoral arteriograms. And then we recommended operation, which we did. We did a aorto bi-external iliac artery bypass with bilateral FemPops and had to top it off with a cholecystectomy.
What were the facilities like, George?
Well, their facilities were okay. They didn't have a lot of instruments. If we hadn't brought our instruments, we would have been in trouble. They didn't have the sutures that we have, the Prolene and etc. So I was glad that we had that. We took a monitor over there so we could monitor his blood pressure and EKG during the operation. And what happened with that was they weren't used to using those monitors either. So the day that we did his operation, when we finished, everybody wanted to go upstairs to have a little break and have some lunch and something to drink, etc. They wanted me to go up there with them. I said, no, I'm going to stay down here and watch him and make sure everything's okay. I stayed down there for a while. He was stable, looking good. And so they said, come on up. So I went up there, and I was up there for about half an hour. I said, I want to go back and check him, see what's going on. I walked into the operating room where we'd kept him. He looked like a corpse. I said, oh my goodness, we are in trouble. I said, what's his blood pressure doing? They said, it's 120/80. Looked at the monitor, that's what it was. But what they'd done is, as his blood pressure dropped down, they turned up the gain on it. So it looked good. And fortunately, I was able to give him a couple units of blood, get him hydrated, and he survived without blocking off any of his grafts. I thought we had a sure trip to Siberia when I first saw him down there, but everything worked out okay.
What was the hospital like?
Well, the hospital, it was, the Bakolev Institute. It was a nice hospital for that time. For that period of time, it was okay.
Did you stay and take care of him?
We stayed for a week to take care of him, make sure everything was okay before we came back home. And subsequently, he did okay. He was also, in addition to being the head of the Academy of Science, was very influential and or knowledgeable in aircraft, aerodynamics. Took care of shimmies and shutters in the airplanes. Was part of the group that decided on trajectories, etc., with the rockets and with the
Wow.
space industry. So he was also involved in that a lot.
Wow. In 1996, Mr. Yeltsin needed surgery, and this was coronary disease. Here's an article from, again, the New York Times. The American heart surgeon, Dr. Michael DeBakey, and other foreign specialists. Were you one of the foreign specialists?
I was one of the foreign specialists.
Were called to advise on the Russian team that would perform a coronary bypass on Boris Yeltsin. I know you went over there with Dr. DeBakey. What was that like, George?
Well, the first thing that happened was that he did have coronary disease, and he was having some low-grade heart failure. And they had called Dr. DeBakey to come over and take a look at him to see if he was a candidate for surgery. And he reviewed his system and decided that he would be a candidate for surgery, but needed to get in better shape. And part of the cardiomyopathy might have been related to alcohol. I'm not sure. But anyway, his heart function did get better as he was being prepared for surgery over a period of several months, and he had some hypothyroidism, etc. But when it came time to do the surgery, the surgeon was Renaud Arcturian, who had, we'd seen him over there before, and he'd spent some time with us in Houston. Because of the heart failure that he had, we weren't certain whether he was going to have a problem coming off the pump, so we took over, they had intra-aortic balloons, so we didn't have to bring a balloon. But we had centrifugal pumps and a Novacor ventricular assist device on standby in case we needed to use that if he didn't come off pump and had problems. And fortunately he did well and had an uncomplicated recovery. One of the differences between when we were over there with him, with the previous experience in the Soviet Union with Keldich, was that there was a lot of news coverage. Every day there was news coverage around the world. There was news coverage also in Russia at that time, which there wasn't anything in the news when we were there with Keldich. It was all hush-hush. And of course there was a lot of difference in Moscow between the two times as far as the number of cars, the shops, et cetera, et cetera. It was a completely different Moscow from what we had first witnessed when we went over there.
Did you enjoy these trips? Were they a good time? Or?
Well, they were good. Yeah, I mean, of course they were good times. They were hard work, and we had to make sure everything turned out all right. But from our experience with Keldich, who I said was involved in aerospace, etc., we developed a program jointly between the United States and with the Academy of Transplantation Assist Devices over in Russia to develop left ventricular assist devices and total artificial hearts.
Really?
Yeah.
Is that still ongoing, George?
No, it's not ongoing now. That finished up. We didn't really come out with a good pump that we could use in patients. But what was interesting, I think it was in 76, it was the 60th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, and we were in Tashkent, and at the airport, and some people came up asking us to sign our autographs, and they had these publications from TASS which were showing the achievements during the 50-year period. And we were underneath the astronauts. The astronauts were above us, and the Dr. Shumakov and myself were below with our artificial hearts as a celebrating part of the 50th anniversary achievement of the Soviet Union, which was a surprise to us.
Golly, that must have been an incredible time.
Right,
George.
we had a good time.
Now, and finally, you were asked to operate on Dr. DeBakey himself.
Right.
For a problem that he had been primarily responsible for describing and classifying and so forth, the dissector. You ended up operating on him at age 97. Could you talk to us about that, George, what that was like?
Well, what it was like was, first of all, Dr. Bakey had been doing well. He'd been traveling around the world, etc., up to that point. And he was at home in his study doing some reading, and he developed a sudden pain in his right side of the chest, upper chest, and going up in his neck, etc. It was really, he said, it's the worst pain he'd ever had. He wasn't sure what it was, but he thought, you know, this is either myocardial infarction or I've had a dissection. So I was out of town, but some of my colleagues went over there and they examined him and thought that that was a possibility, but his blood pressure was stable, his EKG was okay, it didn't look like he had an infarct. He didn't want to go to the hospital at that time. So we waited several days and we did a CAT scan, which demonstrated that he had about a 5.5 centimeter ascending aortic type 2 aneurysm. It was mainly an intramural hematoma. There was no flap that we could identify at that time. And so we showed the pictures to him and it went over the possibilities, which he knew all the possibilities, and he elected that he would like to just ride it out and see what happened. And then we got serial scans over the next about 5 weeks, and each time we got a scan the aneurysm was larger and larger till the last scan we did. He then had a flap that showed for the first time, and he had pericardial effusion like he was impending rupture. So our recommendation at that time was that if we're going to do anything, we're going to either do it now or we're not going to do anything, because he's never going to, you know, survive. Right. And at the same time that we did that scan that morning that showed an enlargement of the aneurysm of the flap, it had an artifact in the back of his brain. It looked like he might have had a hemorrhage. And so we said, you know, of course with this, if there's hemorrhage there's, you know, forget it, we're not going to be able to do anything at all. So we got a stat CAT scan on him, which showed that it was okay. There was no problem there. So the family got together, and that was his wife, his daughter, two of his sons, and his 2 sisters. And we, you know, talked over the options, which they knew. They'd been following ever since the thing had occurred. And they wanted to go ahead and do the operation. So we said okay, and went down and talked to anesthesia. And, well, they initially said okay. And so they were preparing to take him down there, or to get him ready to go down there. And then they came up to the room and said, we're not going to put him to sleep because he doesn't want to have an operation. And what happened was that one of the internists had written in the chart that he didn't want an operation. Well, that was at that specific time. He wasn't ready. He didn't want to be operated on. But he never said, I never want to be operated on. In fact, when he was having the problems, I asked him on more than one occasion, I said, now look, you know, it may come to the point that somewhere down the line you're not going to be able to tell us yes or no, whatever you want us to do. What do you want me to do in that situation if you're unable to make that decision? said, I want you to do what you think is appropriate for, you know, for me. I want you to do what's right. So we said, okay. But the anesthesia didn't know that. But anyway, they said they weren't going to put him to sleep because it was written in the chart that they didn't want to have it. And it was also written in the chart that he didn't want to have a DNR. He didn't want to be resuscitated if he arrested. And they considered maybe anesthesia was putting him to sleep so like he was arrested. But anyway, there was another anesthesiologist who he had known and worked with at the Brown-Fondler building who was working at the VA. And they said, call her and see if she would do it, and she said she would. So she came over there, but then the ethics committee was worried, and they got together, and we'd started early in the morning with, you know, getting things prepared and studies done so we'd know what we were going to be doing. And so the ethics committee had to call all our members in to have a discussion about what should be done. And after they were in there for about half an hour, his wife just, you know, got upset and said, listen, she went into the room and said, you know, while you're doing this, my husband's dying. I want my husband to go to surgery and get taken care of. And the ethics committee said, okay. So we went, and it was about midnight when we went down to surgery at that time. And of course we did his operation, which we resected his ascending aorta, resuspended the aortic valve. We had to go to hypothermia arrest and used retrograde cerebral perfusion, etc. You know, the standard procedure. And we got him through it.
So the operation went very well.
The operation went well, yes. He had a long recovery because he was very weak when we got started with his surgery.
Right.
One of the things that happened, that he was a very determined individual, as you know. And after about, I guess, 4 days following the diagnosis of his aneurysm, he was supposed to give a lecture at the Texas Academy of Medicine Science, or the Academy of Medicine Science of Tamas, Texas. And we said, you know, Dr. Becky, I know you want to give this lecture, but you really shouldn't be going over there. And, you know, I think it's dangerous. We'd be glad to give it for you. And he said, I'm going.
So he did.
So he did. And we were, you know, crowded on. He went there, he gave the lecture, and one of the things he wanted to do was Kay Bailey Hutchison, our senator, was there. He had a meeting with her. And then when his lecture was over, he met with her, then went out to eat lunch before he went back home. And it was interesting that I stayed for lunch that day, and there were people at my table saying, you know, that Dr. Becky is amazing. He said, here he is, 97 years old. He gives this lecture. He gave it all without reading anything, and it's just unbelievable that an individual could do that. And they just didn't know that he
They didn't know the half of it, did they?
They didn't know the half of it.
George, you had association during this time with several other giants in vascular surgery. Talk to us for a moment about your association with Dr. Dietrich during this time when the controversial novel Hearts was being written.
Well, of course, Ted Dietrich and I were on a service together as associates at that time. And Ted was a very energetic individual who was very instrumental in doing the things lined up to do our first heart transplants, and was working on a preservation machine for the heart-lung machine. But Ted's a very competent and ingenious individual.
Dr. Cooley, before he went to Texas Heart, what was your association with Dr. Cooley?
Well, I had two associations with Dr. Cooley. One was when I was a medical student. I was working with a pump team and doing cardiopulmonary bypass operation, you know, running the pump for that. And then came back as a resident and worked with him. And then after I completed my residency, I spent 6 months with Dr. Cooley before I went over and worked full-time with Dr. DeBakey. And of course, Dr. Cooley is a master surgeon that everyone would try and emulate. And he was very meticulous, fast, but didn't make any false movements, and was, I guess, as good a surgeon as anybody in the world.
You also had time with Dr. Crawford, Dr. Morris, and Ed Garrett. What were they like?
Well, I spent more time when I first started after completion of my residency with Ed Garrett, who was a real gentleman.
Oh, yeah.
And he was a lovely man to be around. And he was part of that first coronary bypass in 1976 or 77.
Right, he and Jimmy.
And Jimmy Howe. He and Jimmy, and he was a very pleasant man to be around and very conscientious, a master surgeon, and I really enjoyed my time with him. And same with Hal. He was just a couple of years ahead of me, so I didn't work that much with him. But with later on worked some, with George Morris a little bit, not very much, mostly with the Bakey. And of course Crawford was a genius, Alabama genius. He was a master surgeon himself and really developed especially aneurysm and thoracoabdominal.
In 1988, you met with NASA to develop a ventricular assist device. What was that all about? How did you get interested in doing that, George?
Well, since the 1960s, we had been working in the lab developing assist devices, both the total artificial heart and left ventricular assist devices. And in 1966 was the first time that one of these paracorporeal left ventricular devices had been used in a patient post-cardiotomy to recovery and was removed. And so that was exciting to see that happen. Then we had a period of time where we really didn't do any implants until the 1980s. And we were doing left ventricular assist device and also had the total artificial heart. But these were big devices, cumbersome, made a lot of noise, were difficult to implant, and required a fairly good-sized patient to receive the device. And so we decided we needed to do something else. And the only way to go would be to some type of centrifugal or axial flow pump, which we could make smaller. So we figured that a good place to start would be with the engineers at NASA and see if they had any experience with those type of pumps. And so we called one of our patients who was an engineer at NASA before we operated on him, and we had done a heart transplant on him. We called him up, Mr. David Saucier, and told him what we wanted. So he said he would put us in touch with the individuals that did that kind of work. So we went out with Dr. Bakey, myself, and other people that were working with us at that time, and plus our devices that we were using or had available. And we met with these three engineers, and they looked it over. Then we started from scratch. There was no prototypes. There was nobody had ever done any work like this before. We knew that the axial flow pump could work because there was one called the hemo pump, which was put in percutaneously. It was a very small axial flow pump that had output of like 2 liters per minute at 25,000 revolutions per minute without really destroying the blood. So the engineers at NASA started working on it, and Dr. Bakey was able to get them some money to help with the development of it. And once they had a pump that looked like it would do the pumping characteristics that we required, they said, we think we have something that's going to work and we're ready to try it in blood, because we told them blood was just like outer space. It was really a hostile environment. And so the first pumps that we started up and ran, and within a minute all the red blood cells were just completely destroyed. So after about 50-some iterations of the pump, we were able to get it so it was virtually atraumatic and able to pump without any difficulty. So we went from there, from the mock loops into the animals, and then in 1998 we did our first clinical implant in Berlin.
From a flow dynamics point of view, did you know that pulsatile flow was not necessary prior to this project?
We didn't know for sure. We knew that we could temporarily, for hours or for a week or so, or maybe a couple of weeks, support individuals with continuous flow, which we had done. And so we know for that period of time that they could work, but as far as getting something back to normal activity, we had no idea. When you look at the pressure in the vascular system, the arteries, the main arteries and arterioles are the only place there's pulsatility. The rest of it is a continuous constant flow. So I said, you know, if you get rid of that arterial pulse, is that going to make a difference? And no one knew for sure, but what we've seen subsequently is, and we were the first ones to show in the world with long-term implants, that you can live perfectly well with continuous flow without a pulse. And if you look at the pumps that are being used today, the previously used pulse-style pumps have been discarded, and no real new pulse-style pumps are being developed. It's all some type of a continuous flow, whether it's an axial or a sort of centrifugal pump.
Wow. Now, let's spend a moment to talk about transplantation. In 1968, early work on transplant began, but was stopped due to rejection and infection. 1988, transplant program was resumed due to better immunosuppressive therapy. Where are we now with transplantation, George?
Well, we've, of course, come a long way from the initial days, and at the present time we have not only the immunosuppression, which is a general suppression, but more targeted suppression, so we're able to get by with better immunologic control in these patients. So we've come a long way. We still have a ways to go, but and then patients that are have high what we call PRAs, we're able to get those down with specific treatments before they're transplanted on to reduce the chances of getting a humoral or cellular rejection.
Do you think that transplantation now could be considered standard therapy?
Not when you're taking care of those sick patients. I wouldn't say it's just. Now we have options, of course, is that we have these patients that are on assist devices that are the longest one, for example, with a continuous flow, axial flow pump, died after 7.5 years on a pump, and it didn't die from pump failure, it died from something else. So we have pumps that are going out for long periods of time, so we can delay doing transplants, or we can just support them with a device rather than transplant, because the number of transplants is limited. So we have a little over 2,000 transplants that are done per year in the United States, but that's not nearly enough to cover the number of individuals that could benefit from a transplant.
Speak to us for a moment, George, about your mentors. I'm sure Dr. DeBakey would be high on your list, and your father. Can you speak to what things you learned from them?
I would say the main thing I learned from them is that you got to work hard, keep your focus, and just keep on going. What other individuals would you consider mentors, George, besides these two individuals? Well, in our training program, you know, there's Dr. George Jordan, Dr. Paul Jordan were mentors, along with Stanley Crawford and George Morris, because those are individuals that I worked with. One of the things that's different in our training today and what we had when we came through is that since vascular and cardiac surgery were just being developed, Dr. Bakey was basically a general surgeon who'd done some thoracic work.
Yeah.
And when we went through our program, we were general surgeons, we were vascular surgeons, and we were cardiovascular surgeons. And we did that. I did that till I retired 4 years ago. I did general surgery, did cardiac surgery, did transplant surgery, did assist devices, etc.
Well, that's the Houston way, isn't it?
That was the Houston way. Of course, that's going to be faded out. So now you have to decide whether you're going to be a vascular surgeon, you're going to be a cardiac surgeon, you're going to be a general surgeon. What kind of a general surgeon? You're going to be GI, endocrine, oncology. We did it all, and it was exciting to be able to do that.
George, one of the things that's really fascinated me over the years, and watching particularly other productive people such as yourself, is time management. Being able to balance your time between surgery and your personal life, family, so forth. Do you have any tips for young surgeons about how to develop better skills in time management?
I wasn't very good at time management. I spent all my time working in the operating room, on the floor. But I mean, if you're going time management requires an effort of getting things organized, and then stick by your organizational plan. And that's one of the things with Dr. Bakey. He was very, very good in the way he organized things, and to be able to accomplish all the things that he did as a surgeon, as an educator, as a statesman, etc. And it's just it's unbelievable. But one of the reasons that he was a stern master, or had to be, is that he didn't have time to waste. If you did something that created a problem, a wrinkle in the time management, you heard about it.
You in trouble.
Yeah, so it didn't happen a second time. But that's the only way he could get done what he was trying to accomplish. He was very well organized. Of course, he's a genius to begin with.
George, I'd like to ask you a series of questions now that require just your opinion.
Okay.
American medicine, I think it's safe to say, has now become a political football. With Obamacare, so forth. Do you think we've lost our way? Do you think that American medicine can remain at the forefront of world medicine?
I think it's going to be a struggle. One of the things that it becomes more and more computerized. Electronic medical records and all the data entry, etc., that has to be done. And our patients, for example, say that in the intensive care unit, because of all the paperwork that they have to do, that it's 10% patient and 90% other work on the computer, etc., keeping the records. The offices, it's difficult up in the offices to get everything certified, everything you need to do for the insurance companies for registration, etc. That part of medicine we don't like. I mean, I like taking care of patients, but not all the other things that are going with it these days.
Several years ago, SVS and ISCVS, the North American chapter, merged. Do you think this has been harmful with regard to international exchange, which was always a huge part of the Houston program?
By the merging of the two societies?
You think it's been harmful?
I don't think so. Why would, I don't understand why it would be.
Well, as far as ISCVS seemed to have more of an influence on trying to encourage international exchange.
Mm-hmm.
Now that the two groups have merged, do you think that's harmed international exchange?
I really don't know. I couldn't answer that question.
Okay. Several years ago, several of the leaders of vascular surgery pushed hard for an independent board for vascular surgery, despite the fact that over 50% of the membership of SVS voted in favor of independence. It was defeated. Why do you think that happened?
I don't know. Well, you know why that really happened. I can't answer that question.
Do you think an independent board of vascular surgery would be a benefit?
I think it would be a benefit, of course. But I don't know why it didn't go through.
I have some thoughts on that, but it's certainly multifactorial.
All right.
George, there's been another revolution in vascular surgery, and that's been endovascular surgery. What are your thoughts on endovascular surgery?
Well, I think that endovascular surgery, of course, is just like we were back in the 50s. It's a developing method of treating aneurysmal and occlusive disease. And I think we were skeptical at first when things were first being tried out. But as we progress in the development of the devices, it's here to stay and going to be here to stay. It's just a matter of seeing which of the procedure was going to be best suited for each individual patient. I think one of the things that we're seeing now is that many of the vascular surgeons that are being trained are competent in endovascular surgery, but they're not really competent in doing open surgery.
Right.
So that's the only problem that I see.
What's your favorite airplane?
My favorite airplane? Well, I've flown two airplanes in most of my life. One was a twin-engine Aerostar, which I really enjoyed flying, and I've got a single-engine Bonanza that I fly too. So those are my favorites.
Particularly ones that stay up in the air,
the ones
come
that stay
down
up,
when you want them
right.
to. George, do you have any advice for young surgeons coming along today?
Well, you know, one of the things that's happening is that there are changing methods of treatment in the fields of surgery, so that what we learned 50 years ago or 40 years ago is becoming obsolete. And so they've got to see how that's going to affect their practice. So for example, for aneurysms, to treatment surgically, only the surgeon could do it. When you go with the endovascular, the surgeons can do it, the radiologists do it, the cardiologists do it, and so it's divided up so that your total experience is going to be diminished because there's so many people that are involved in doing those types of surgery or treatments.
So your advice is to?
My advice is look at and see what's happening in the field and decide whether there's going to be enough for you to do when you finish up your training with what you're learning how to do.
Final question, George. Do you think there'll ever be another Michael DeBakey?
I'm sure there'll be another Michael DeBakey, but I don't know when and where. Not many people really knew all of Dr. DeBakey.
Right.
The residents knew him as a taskmaster in the operating room. Over to school and administration, he was an administrator and brought the medical center to where it is today. He was participating in the care and advice to the United States presidents from Truman on up to the time that he died. One of the things that we didn't mention is that he was very proud to receive the gold medal, the Congressional Gold Medal. And if we had not have operated on him and saved his life, he would never have received that award.
Right.
And he was very, 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 very humbled by the choice. And one of the things about being elected and confirmed for that was it had to go through the Senate and the House, and he had a unanimous vote in both the Senate and the House before it went to President Bush to be signed. So how many individuals or how many things have you know of that had 100% unanimous vote in both the Senate and the House?
I can't think of one.
So he was glad that he was alive to receive that.
George, thank you for your time today.
You're welcome.
Thank you for this interview.
You're welcome.